Hello everyone. I'm Rahul Sandhya, and in this next lecture of IoT, this is in continuation of the previous lecture where we were discussing the REST architecture. We have seen the main feature of the REST architecture, that it is resource-oriented architecture. It has every resource has a unique identifier URL, and then we saw it some of the features that it is stateless. Then it uses hypermedia as a engine of state transform, and then uh, it uses HTTP verb to change the resources from server to client, and use hypermedia to change the state. The client side representation basically is changed using the links in the hypermedia. So these are the REST architecture. So why the REST architecture is important for the internet? In this lecture, we will see why we should look at the REST while designing our IoT system. So basically, what is the purpose of, if you to seek this answer, we should look what is the purpose of IoT. IoT uses all the existing technology, that is say M2M communication, embedded device, that is the smart devices, and incorporating give it try to give, and it uses the internet to provide that services. So basically it try to make these services that is based on the machine, physical devices, smart things services, uh, as much as the web view. So that because the web penetration is in fact the most uh, of all the technology. Every person knows how to has access to the internet connectivity, can access a web page, can provide some can use the benefit of service. So basically the internet basically try to reach these smart thing services to in hand of common persons. So for that, it utilized the existing internet architecture. That's why the REST is important. For if we can, or if we can design our IoT system just like the REST architecture, it will reap the benefit of the existing web architecture. So how can we do that? In this video lecture, we will defining basically seeking this answer. So basically, look at the REST again. It is a resource-oriented architecture. So a REST architecture is basically a resource-oriented architecture. Present an abstraction of resources implemented via RESTful interfaces. RESTful platform based on REST development technology enable the creation of ROA, whose main concepts are resources. And what is resource? Basically, anything important that can have unique identity. Anything that is important enough to be referenced as a thing itself. Okay, anything that much important which must have some reference. Resource name, that is URL, unique identification of the resource. Then we have resource representation, useful information about the current state of the resource. This is the important. The representation and resource is resource representation is little bit different from the resource. Resource representation also give the information about the current state of the resources. For example, an image. Say we have an image in text. It can be of it can have a different size for a say mobile application, and it has a different size for say desktop application. Desktop browser installed on the using on the desktop. So a same image can have two different sizes. So its representations must be in such a way that describe the state of that image. So resource representation, useful information about the current state of the resources. Resource link, which is another representation of the same or the other resources. Link to another representation. What does the resource link provide? It provide link to another representation. And then resource interface, uniform interface for accessing the resource and manipulating its state. That is, so if we look at this, say, important part: resource name, resource representation, resource link, and resource interface. So these, if we think REST architecture in terms of resource, these 5 terms can describe the REST architecture: resource, resource name, resource representation, resource link, and resource interface. So if you remember these 5 things, you will define the REST. What is REST architecture? So what is basically, now ask the question, what is the resource? Resource is anything at the server. Basically, it can be a information stored in the database, it can be a image stored, it can be a file. So anything that is important enough that has unique URL. Resource name, every resource has a name, that is the URL. URL basically is the unique identifier. This name is used to identify that resource, and this is provided by URL. Resource representation, this is provided by, say, a resource has some representation. It can be in the form of HTML, XML, JSON, simple plain text, and whatever. And the fourth thing is the resource link. Means hypermedia as an engine of state 8 US. That is, it use hypermedia to do that. And then we have resource interface. Interface means how these resources can be fixed, how this resource can be modified, how this resource can be manipulated. And this is provided by using HTTP web, that is get, post, put, patch, delete. So this is the summary of REST architecture. Okay. So how IoT can be designed, how the IoT system can be looked from the REST architecture point of view. So for that purpose, basically we have to define resource in the smart things. We know that the end node in the IoT is basically a smart things. What we call the smart things has some identity that is important for even IoT. So this smart node can be treated as a resource, and if we provide functionality of this smart thing, just like the resource, we can basically use the REST architecture for designing our even IoT system. So IoT can be defined as a worldwide network of interconnected smart things, and enabled to interact and communicate with each other as well as with the environment by exchanging data and information sent from the environment. So what are the smart things? That is which can interact and communicate with the environment or other smart things, or can exchange the data and information from the environment. Anything communicates. What is a smart thing basically? A smart thing is that anything communicates. Smart things have the ability to wireless communicate among themselves and from ad hoc networks interconnected. Anything is identified. This is important, that smart things can be easily identified, can have a unique name. Smart things are identified with digital name. Then a smart interface. Anything interact. A smart thing can interact with the local environment through sensing and actuating capabilities whenever presented. So anything that communicate, anything that is identified, and anything that interact, basically interact with the environment, and that means sensing and actuating capability. So if you look at the resources, and if you compare the smart things and the resources, so we have the similarity that anything is identified, anything interact, the resources has linked with another, anything that communicate. This smart things communicate with another smart things. So this, we have resources as a hypermedia. So we can access one resource, we can change the state from one resource to another resource. This first point is also, and then anything can interact. resource can interact with the environment. That means so smart things can be made as an integral part of the web by they are embedded into a standard web architecture. Thus, the term Web of Things uh, WAT can be considered as a part of subset of the IoT, which can incorporate similar characteristics and application models as IoT. Redefining resource for IoT as specified by RFC 3986. Any entity that has identity can be a resource. So basically the definition of resource simply says that anything entity that has identity can be a resource. Even abstract concepts such as mathematical operator in an equation can be a resource. We can define resource to incorporate a smart things. A web resource is any real or abstract entity that can be identified and accessed within the IP network. So the nodes in the IoT network has a unique IP also. So a web resource gives access to a specific functionality, and our smart thing provides some functionality, or is a part by using sensing and say actuating capability, or is a part of composition of other resources to provide a well-defined network application functionality. So after defining the resources, smart things as a resources, we can build an IoT system just like the REST architecture. Say in this picture we can see the similarity of IoT and the REST architecture. We have the sensor web interfaces. Say we have here interfaces that send requests using say HTTP using some URL, and this URL basically describe what node to access and what information to access. Basically we can it is reached to some interface, a gateway, just like our web server. This gateway at our web service. So and then this web server, sorry, this gateway acts as our web server, and then we can connect to some resources using the address here. So basically, if you look at this URL, the concept becomes more clear. Say we are accessing some using HTTP from say machine. So physical UART directory, UART 0, baud rate, value 960. In this way, you can give all the necessary information, all the necessary information to fetch the data from a particular smart things. You can use to give the instruction or for some actuating to control some smart things, can fetch some data, can manipulate in this way. So in this way we can use the existing REST architecture for the IoT, and that will help IoT to reach more to use more and more web architecture, and this is called the Web of Things. So this is the end of this lecture.